The Japanese soldiers stood over Bill Chong with rifles pointed at his head. Blood ran down his face from where they'd beaten him. His hands were raw and blistered from digging. They'd made him dig his own grave right there in the Chinese countryside in 1943. One of the soldiers asked him a question in broken English. Did he want to be shot or beheaded? Bill looked at the fresh earth, at the hole he'd just dug for himself, and chose the bullet. Quicker that way, less suffering. He closed his eyes and waited for the crack of the rifle. The man they wouldn't let swim in Vancouver's public pools was about to die in occupied China. But this wasn't the first time Agent 50 had stared down death, and it wouldn't be the last. Bill Chong's story begins thousands of miles from that grave in a Vancouver that didn't want him. He was born there in 1911, a Chinese-Canadian kid growing up in an era when that hyphen meant everything. It meant you couldn't vote. It meant you couldn't use the public swimming pool alongside white Canadians. It meant you worked menial jobs for low pay, and opportunities for advancement were non-existent. Equality wasn't just out of reach. It was a fantasy. The discrimination wasn't subtle or hidden. It was explicit, codified, built into the structure of Canadian society. Signs in shop windows read, "No Chinese." Landlords refused to rent to Chinese families outside designated areas. Professional schools wouldn't accept Chinese students. The government enforced a head tax specifically targeting Chinese immigrants, charging them money just for the privilege of entering a country that would then deny them basic rights. By the time Bill was born, that head tax had reached $500, a fortune in 1911, roughly equivalent to 2 years' wages for a laborer. The message was clear. Canada wanted Chinese labor, but not Chinese people. Bill grew up watching his parents and their generation navigate this reality. They built businesses that served the Chinese community because white-owned businesses wouldn't hire them. They created their own social networks because they were excluded from mainstream Canadian society. They worked twice as hard for half the respect. And they taught their children to keep their heads down, work hard, and accept the limitations placed on them because fighting back would only make things worse. Bill eked out a living as a house servant and cook, cleaning other people's homes, preparing their meals, living on the margins of a society that had carved out a very specific space for Chinese people. And that space was small, and it was at the bottom. He cooked Western food for families who probably never learned his name. He scrubbed floors in houses he could never afford to live in. He earned wages that kept him poor, but not quite destitute. This was the ceiling for Chinese Canadians. No matter how smart you were, how hard you worked, how much you contributed, you remained in service to a society that saw you as fundamentally lesser. When World War II erupted and Canada joined the fight, the local Chinese community split over a fundamental question. Should Chinese Canadians volunteer to fight for a country that treated them as second-class citizens? The debate played out in community halls, in restaurants, in homes across Vancouver's Chinatown. One camp said no, absolutely not. Why risk your life for a nation that wouldn't even let you vote? Why die for a country that charged your parents $500 just to enter, then denied you the most basic rights of citizenship? The government wanted Chinese labor when it was convenient, Chinese bodies when it needed them, but it never wanted Chinese people as equals. So why fight? The other camp saw military service differently. They argued that volunteering would shift public perception, that fighting and dying alongside white Canadians would prove that Chinese Canadians deserved full citizenship. War created opportunities that peace never would. If Chinese Canadians distinguished themselves in combat, if they bled for Canada, if they came home as decorated veterans, maybe, just maybe, the country would finally recognize them as equals. As one veteran put it years later, they weren't demanding something extra. They just wanted to be equal. Military service was the price of admission to a society that had always kept them locked outside. Both camps were right. Both camps understood the brutal calculus of discrimination, but they disagreed about whether dignity could be earned from a system that had never granted it freely, or whether demanding it unconditionally was the only path forward. Bill Chong fell into that second camp. He loved Canada despite everything, and he tried to enlist in the army. Picture this moment. A 30-year-old house servant and cook, a man who'd spent his entire life being told he wasn't good enough, walking into a military recruitment office. He was ready to serve, ready to prove himself, ready to risk everything for a country that had given him nothing but rejection and exclusion his entire life. The recruiters looked at him and turned him away. They weren't enthusiastic about signing up a Chinaman. The word itself was a slur, but it was the casual language of the era, the everyday racism that didn't even recognize itself as hatred because it was just how things were. Bill left that recruitment office carrying a rejection that confirmed everything the first camp had argued. Canada didn't want Chinese soldiers. It didn't matter that he was born in Vancouver. Didn't matter that he spoke perfect English. Didn't matter that he was willing to die for his country. He was Chinese, and that was disqualifying. He went back to cooking and cleaning, back to his small life on the margins, back to scrubbing floors in houses owned by families whose sons were being welcomed into the military with open arms. It started with death in the family. Bill's father died in Canton in 1941, and his sister, who lived in Hong Kong, sent word that he needed to come help settle the estate. Probate matters, inheritance questions, the bureaucratic tangle that follows death across international borders. Bill traveled to Hong Kong expecting to stay a few weeks, maybe a month at most. The paperwork turned out to be more complicated than anyone anticipated. Lawyers needed signatures. Documents required translation. Assets needed valuation. Weeks became months. He was still there on December 7th, 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and kicked off the Pacific War. Within hours, the world changed. Japan didn't just attack Hawaii, they launched coordinated strikes across the Pacific, the Philippines, Malaya, Thailand, and Hong Kong. On December 8th, Japanese bombers appeared over Hong Kong, hitting the airport at Kai Tak and destroying most of Britain's air defenses on the ground. The garrison defending Hong Kong included Canadian units, the Winnipeg Grenadiers and the Royal Rifles of Canada, roughly 2,000 soldiers who'd arrived just weeks earlier. The same military that had rejected Bill's enlistment was now fighting and dying just miles from where he stood. The Japanese forces crossed into the new territories on the mainland, overwhelming British defensive positions. The defenders retreated to Hong Kong Island, blowing up bridges behind them, hoping the water would slow the Japanese advance. It didn't. On December 18th, Japanese forces invaded Hong Kong Island itself. They crossed the harbor at night, landing on the northeastern shore, then pushed inland. The battle lasted a week. Heavy fighting tore through the streets. Artillery pounded residential neighborhoods. Civilians caught between the armies died by the thousands. The British and Canadian defenders fought hard, but they were outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of ammunition. Japanese forces secured the island piece by piece, and on Christmas Day, 1941, the British commander surrendered. Bill found himself living under occupation, and what he saw appalled him. The Japanese soldiers who flooded into Hong Kong weren't liberators or even conventional occupiers. They were brutal, casual in their violence, seemingly unconstrained by any rules of warfare or human decency. They executed people without cause, without trial, without mercy. They shot civilians in the streets for the crime of being in the wrong place. They beat anyone who looked at them wrong, who moved too slowly, who failed to bow deeply enough. Bill watched them murder people left and right, and the randomness of it was almost worse than the violence itself. You couldn't predict what would set them off. You couldn't keep yourself safe by following rules because there were no consistent rules, just the whims of armed men who saw conquered Chinese as subhuman. And then one day, Bill witnessed something that changed everything. He saw a wounded Canadian officer, already down, already defeated, already helpless, executed by a Japanese soldier. The officer was on the ground, bleeding from wounds sustained in the fighting. He posed no threat. He was finished, and the Japanese soldier just shot him where he lay. No hesitation, no emotion, just the mechanical action of raising a rifle and pulling the trigger. The Canadian officer died in the street like garbage. Bill stood there, watching a Canadian soldier die, and something inside him snapped. This was a man from the country that had rejected Bill, from the military that wouldn't let him serve. But he was also a man who'd fought for the Allied cause, who'd traveled halfway around the world to defend Hong Kong, who'd been wounded in battle and deserved at minimum the dignity of medical treatment or captivity. Instead, he got a bullet. Bill had lived his entire life being told he wasn't good enough to be Canadian. But in that moment, watching that officer die in the street, Bill felt more Canadian than he'd ever felt in Vancouver. The man they wouldn't let enlist decided he was going to fight anyway. Bill sold everything he owned in Hong Kong: furniture, clothes, personal belongings. Everything that had value went to whoever would buy it. He burned his Canadian passport, a document that had given him so little protection, so little status, now reduced to ash. The passport was evidence of his identity, and identity was dangerous under occupation. If the Japanese caught him trying to escape, that passport would be proof of his British Commonwealth status, and that meant torture and execution. Better to have no papers at all than papers that would kill you. He decided to escape to mainland China. When he talked about it later, his motivation was clear and simple. He'd seen too much of the war in Hong Kong. He was full of hate, not the abstract political hatred of opposing nations, but the visceral personal hatred of someone who'd witnessed atrocity after atrocity, who'd watched conquerors treat conquered people as less than human. He'd watched the Japanese kill people, kill Canadians, without any reason at all. They shot anyone they wanted. They gunned down civilians for sport, for convenience, for no reason Bill could discern. He told himself he had to do something about it. He felt like getting a gun and just going out and shooting a few Japanese soldiers. So he decided to escape to China and find a way to fight. He left Hong Kong with nothing but money sewn into his clothes. No supplies, no food, no water, no extra clothing, no provisions of any kind. His reasoning was cold and brutally practical. If the Japanese caught him carrying supplies for a long journey, they'd know immediately he was escaping. They'd execute him on the spot. An empty-handed man could claim he was just traveling to the next village, just visiting relatives, just going about normal business. A man with a backpack full of food and supplies was obviously running, and runners got shot. His plan was to buy food from villages along the way. But when he reached the countryside outside Hong Kong, every village flew a Japanese flag. Every single one was either occupied, collaborating, or too terrified to refuse Japanese demands. Bill couldn't risk walking into any of them, so he survived on raw vegetables, dug from gardens in the dead of night. He crept through the darkness like a thief, found vegetable gardens on the outskirts of villages, pulled carrots and cabbage and whatever else he could find from the earth, and ate them dirty and uncooked. The taste was terrible. The dirt scratched his throat, but he was alive and he kept moving. The journey took days. Bill walked through the night, slept in ditches during the day, avoided roads where Japanese patrols might spot him. His feet blistered. His body ached. He was hungry, thirsty, exhausted, terrified. Every noise could be a patrol. Every distant shout could be Japanese soldiers. He moved through a landscape of fear, through countryside that had become a prison, through territory where being Chinese didn't protect you because the Japanese killed Chinese just as readily as they killed anyone else. His plan was vague: find Chinese guerrillas, join up, kill Japanese soldiers. But before he could connect with any resistance fighters, he ran into a British military intelligence officer who saw something in this Chinese-Canadian refugee that Bill himself probably didn't recognize. The officer was part of Britain's intelligence network in China, one of many operatives trying to organize resistance against Japanese occupation. He talked to Bill, heard his story, learned about his fluency in English and Chinese, and made a calculation. This man would be more valuable as a clandestine agent than as another guerrilla with a rifle. The officer convinced him that intelligence work would let him hurt the Japanese far more effectively than joining guerrillas ever could. A guerrilla might kill a few soldiers in an ambush. An intelligence agent could provide information that destroyed entire units, that disrupted supply lines, that saved hundreds of Allied lives. The Canadian military had scorned Bill when he tried to enlist. The British welcomed him with open arms. Bill spoke fluent English and fluent Chinese, Cantonese and Mandarin both. That combination made him ideally suited for intelligence work in occupied southern China. He could pass as a local Chinese civilian, could speak with villagers and merchants, and laborers without raising suspicion. But he could also communicate complex information to British command in perfect English, could write detailed reports, could brief officers and debrief escaped prisoners. He was a bridge between worlds, and in wartime intelligence, bridges were invaluable. He was assigned to the Directorate of Military Intelligence, Section MI9. Most people know about MI5 and MI6, domestic and foreign intelligence. Fewer know about MI9, which had a specific mandate. MI9 was responsible for helping Allied prisoners of war escape from enemy captivity and return to friendly territory. They developed escape and evasion techniques, created maps printed on silk that could be hidden in uniforms, trained pilots and soldiers on what to do if shot down or captured behind enemy lines. And they ran networks of agents in occupied territory whose job was to find escaped POWs, guide them to safety, and gather intelligence along the way. When MI9's subunit, the British Army Aid Group, known as BAAG, asked for volunteers for hazardous work, Bill stepped forward. BAAG was a paramilitary organization operating in southern China with two primary missions. First, gather intelligence on Japanese positions, movements, strength, and strategy. Every piece of information about Japanese deployments helped Allied command plan operations and avoid ambushes. Second, help escaped prisoners of war make their way to safety behind Allied lines. When POWs escaped from Japanese camps, they found themselves hundreds of miles behind enemy lines with no food, no maps, no contacts, and no way home. BAAG agents would find them, hide them, feed them, and guide them through occupied territory to Chongqing, China's wartime capital far to the west. There, the escapees would be debriefed, their intelligence analyzed, and they'd be sent back to the war effort. Throughout the war, BAAG sent dozens of agents into Japanese occupied territory. Many were caught, many were tortured, many were executed. The Japanese didn't take kindly to spies and treated captured agents with horrific brutality. But BAAG kept sending agents because the work was too important to stop. Every escaped POW represented valuable intelligence about camp conditions, Japanese military strength, and occupation policies. Every agent operating behind enemy lines provided real-time intelligence that couldn't be obtained any other way. Bill Chong was given a code name, Agent 50. 50. The number became his identity behind enemy lines, embedded into every communication he sent back to headquarters. Years later, he explained how it worked. They didn't have secure communications or radio equipment. They had to use Chinese telegraph offices, which meant messages had to seem innocuous to anyone reading them. Every message he sent back had to include the word 50. He'd write that he was going back for his mother's 50th birthday. He was waiting for transportation, mundane things. That's how headquarters knew the message came from him. If he had escapees with him, he'd say he had 3 cattle. 3 cattle meant 3 escaped POWs. The code was simple but effective. Before we go further into what Agent 50 accomplished, I want to tell you what this channel is about. We bring you real stories from history every single day. Stories that reveal unexpected depths, that challenge what you thought you knew, that show you the human beings behind the history books. If you love discovering the hidden layers of the past, the people who shaped our world in ways that never made it into textbooks, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. What we're about to uncover about Bill Chong's years behind enemy lines will show you what real courage looks like when nobody's watching, when there are no medals or recognition, when it's just you against impossible odds. Quick question. Where are you listening from right now? Drop your city and country in the comments below. If you're from Vancouver or Hong Kong, this story probably hits different. New York, London, Manila, Tokyo, let me know. Bill's first mission tested whether the British had made the right call. Contact had been lost with the British consul in Macau, the Portuguese enclave that was officially neutral but crawling with Japanese soldiers. BAAG needed to know if the consul was alive, captured, or dead. Bill had to get into Macau and find out. The problem was geography and occupation. Macau sat at the tip of a peninsula, surrounded by water on 3 sides and Japanese-controlled territory on the 4th. The Japanese maintained heavy patrols throughout the region. They controlled the roads, the harbors, the checkpoints. Getting into Macau meant getting past all of that. Bill quickly learned that trying to reach it by boat meant getting shot. Japanese patrol boats circled the waters constantly, stopping any vessel that looked suspicious, boarding fishing boats, searching cargo. Walking meant getting caught at checkpoints. The Japanese had established a network of roadblocks and inspection stations. Anyone traveling toward Macau had to explain their business, show papers, submit to searches. And Bill had no papers, no legitimate reason to be traveling, nothing that would satisfy Japanese scrutiny. So how was he supposed to get there? Bill traveled to a smuggler's town, the kind of place that existed in the gaps of war. When official channels close, black markets open. When governments can't or won't move goods, criminals will. These towns sprang up throughout occupied China, populated by people who made their living from chaos. Bandits, crooks, outlaws, smugglers who ran contraband past Japanese patrols. Not a good guy in sight, just people making money off suffering and scarcity. Bill checked into what he described as a little crummy hotel, a dive that asked no questions and offered no comforts, the kind of place where you slept with one eye open. He didn't announce his mission, or flash money, or ask direct questions. That would have gotten him killed or turned over to the Japanese. Instead, he just became a presence. He sat in common areas. He bought drinks. He talked about nothing in particular. He listened more than he spoke. He made himself familiar, non-threatening, unremarkable. After days of this, after proving he wasn't a spy for the Japanese or an informant for Chinese authorities, after winning their confidence through patience and careful performance, the smugglers agreed to help. They had routes into Macau, secret paths and bribes and contacts that bypassed Japanese patrols. They snuck Bill in through whatever channels they used for their illegal trade, probably at night, probably by boat through waters they knew the patrol schedules couldn't cover, probably with payments made to certain guards who looked the other way when the price was right. Bill found the consul. The man was fine, just isolated, and cut off from communications. The Japanese hadn't arrested him because Macau was technically neutral, and arresting diplomatic officials would have created international complications even Tokyo wanted to avoid. Mission accomplished. Bill reported back to BAAG with confirmation that their contact was alive and functional. The British now knew they had a working asset in Macau, and they knew Bill Chong could operate in hostile territory, could navigate criminal networks, could complete objectives that seemed impossible on paper. BAAG sent him back out. More missions, different objectives, each one dangerous in its own way. Some involved scouting Japanese troop movements, counting soldiers, identifying units by their insignia and equipment, noting the direction and speed of their movements, assessing their supply situations, then getting that intelligence back to headquarters, where analysts could piece together the broader picture of Japanese military deployments. Other missions meant helping downed Allied pilots and air crews make it to safety. When American and British planes got shot down over occupied China, the crews who survived the crash found themselves stranded hundreds of miles behind enemy lines. If they were lucky, they avoided Japanese patrols long enough for word to reach espionage. Then agents like Bill would locate them, moving from village to village, asking careful questions, following rumors and reports until they found terrified pilots hiding in barns or caves or friendly homes. Once found, the pilots had to be guided through the countryside, avoiding roads and checkpoints, moving at night, covering sometimes 50 miles or more to reach the safety of Allied-controlled territory. Equally dangerous were the mercy missions, delivering desperately needed medicines to BAAG outposts and resistance cells operating behind Japanese lines. Medical supplies were precious, almost impossible to obtain in occupied territory. antibiotics that could save lives from infected wounds, morphine for pain management, surgical equipment for makeshift operations, quinine for malaria, which killed thousands throughout southern China. Without these medicines, people died from conditions that would have been treatable anywhere with proper medical facilities. Bill carried these supplies in his hollowed-out walking stick, in hidden pockets sewn into his clothes, in packages disguised as ordinary cargo. Every medicine delivery was a gamble. If the Japanese caught him with medical supplies, they'd know he was working for the resistance, and that meant torture and execution. The work was physically exhausting in ways that went beyond mere fatigue. Bill traveled the war-torn countryside on foot, sometimes covering 50 miles in a single day. 50 miles through terrain where roads were too dangerous to use and paths were constantly watched. He walked through mountains, forded rivers, cut through forests and farmland. His feet blistered and bled, his legs cramped, his back ached from the walking stick and whatever weight he carried. He slept on bare ground when he could sleep at all, curled up in ditches, or abandoned buildings, or the homes of sympathetic villagers who risked their own lives to shelter him. He ate whatever food he could find or buy without drawing attention. Rice when he was lucky, raw vegetables when he wasn't, sometimes nothing for days. He wore disguises to blend in with local populations, and he affected a limp as cover for using the walking stick. That stick wasn't just for show or support. It had a hollowed-out compartment where he secreted intelligence documents or hid medicines. If the Japanese searched him, they'd see an old man with a cane. They wouldn't think to break it open. But the physical exhaustion was manageable. Humans can endure tremendous physical hardship when they have to. The mental exhaustion was something else entirely. Every day behind enemy lines meant every day could be your last. Every village could be the one where someone recognized you, where someone informed on you, where Japanese soldiers waited to arrest you. Every patrol could be the one that searched you and found the intelligence documents or medicines hidden in your walking stick. Bill moved through a landscape of constant threat, and the psychological stress of that never stopped. You couldn't relax. You couldn't let your guard down for even a moment. One mistake, one wrong word, one suspicious movement, one unlucky encounter, and you'd end up in a grave or a Japanese interrogation cell, which often amounted to the same thing. The work wasn't abstract or distant. Bill wasn't sitting in an office analyzing reports or planning operations from a safe remove. He was face to face with the people he helped, the pilots and POWs who owed him their freedom or their lives. He saw their fear, their relief, their gratitude. He guided them through countryside where Japanese patrols could appear around any turn in the path. He brought them food when they were starving, medicine when they were sick or wounded, hope when they'd given up on ever seeing home again. He watched some of them break down crying when they realized they were going to survive. He watched others maintain stoic silence, too traumatized by their experiences to express emotion. Each person he saved was a human being with a story, with a family back home, with a future that would have ended if Bill hadn't shown up. The exact number of people Agent 50 rescued is unknown and probably unknowable. Years later, Bill addressed the question directly. According to some newspapers, he said, he rescued 1,863 people. That number wasn't true. He never rescued that many. A few hundred, yes, but he didn't keep records. Where would he keep records? He didn't want to be caught with papers saying, on this day I brought so many people. Even BAAG headquarters didn't keep detailed records because everybody was busy. Nobody had time. He brought escapees back, put them on planes, and that was his job. But the numbers, whatever they were, came at tremendous personal risk. Bill was captured 3 times during his years behind enemy lines. 3 times he thought his luck had run out. 3 times he managed to escape. The first capture was the closest he came to death. He was traveling with a guide through the countryside when they spotted a Japanese patrol. They hid, pressed themselves into whatever cover they could find, and stayed silent. But the patrol found them. The soldiers dragged them out, and the beating started immediately. Rifle butts to the face, kicks to the ribs, the methodical violence of men who'd done this many times before. Blood ran down Bill's face. His body screamed with pain. When the beating stopped, the soldiers handed them shovels and pointed to the ground. Dig. Bill and his guide dug their own graves right there. The earth was hard. Their hands blistered. They kept digging because what else could they do? When the holes were deep enough, the Japanese soldiers asked them a question. Did they want to be shot or beheaded? Bill chose the bullet. Better a quick death than the horror of the sword. He stood there at the edge of the grave he'd just dug, covered in his own blood, waiting for the rifle crack that would end everything. This was it. 3 years of work, hundreds of lives saved, and it ended here in the middle of nowhere with a bullet in the back of the head. He closed his eyes. The moment stretched out. And then his guide did something desperate. He pulled out a card, a personal card belonging to a retired Japanese intelligence officer. The guide started talking fast in Japanese, claiming he was one of the officer's agents. The soldiers examined the card. They talked among themselves, and then, inexplicably, they let them go. Bill walked away from his own grave. The Japanese kept the shovels. The second capture was almost surreal in its randomness and cruelty. Bill got swept up in a Japanese roundup, the kind of mass arrest where soldiers just grabbed everyone in a particular area and sorted them out later. Wrong place, wrong time. He was walking through a village when Japanese trucks arrived and soldiers jumped out, shouting orders, herding everyone into the street. There was no time to run, no way to hide. Bill found himself surrounded by other civilians, men, women, elderly people, children, all being forced into the backs of trucks at gunpoint. They were driven to the coast and transferred to a fishing boat, a rickety vessel that looked barely seaworthy. Bill was locked in the hold with dozens of other prisoners. The space was cramped, dark, airless. Bodies pressed against bodies. The smell of sweat and fear filled the confined space. People were crying, praying, whispering to each other in the darkness. Then they heard the hatch being sealed from the outside, followed by the sound of the engine starting. The boat began moving, rolling with the waves, and everyone realized with dawning horror what was happening. The Japanese weren't taking them to a prison camp or an interrogation center. They were setting the boat adrift on the ocean. It was a death sentence with extra steps, a form of execution that required no bullets, no graves, no direct involvement. Just lock people in a hold, set the boat adrift, and let the ocean do the killing. Eventually, everyone would die of thirst or starvation, or the boat would sink and they'd all drown. The Japanese could claim they'd simply released prisoners, that whatever happened afterward wasn't their responsibility. In the hold, panic set in. People screamed and pounded on the hatch, but it didn't budge. The boat drifted, rolling with the swells, and people became seasick, vomiting in the cramped space. Hours passed. The air grew stale and hot. People began to lose hope. But then somebody discovered something. A rotten plank in the hull, down near the waterline. The wood had gone soft from years of water damage, weakened by rot and neglect. Whoever found it called out to the others, and people gathered around. They kicked at the plank, worked at it with their hands, pried at it with whatever they could find. The wood splintered, broke away in chunks. Salt water began seeping in through the gaps, but that didn't matter now. They kept working until finally the plank broke completely, leaving a hole just big enough for a person to crawl through. The hole led to the outside of the hull, just above the waterline. One person, the smallest and bravest among them, volunteered to go through. He squeezed through the opening, dropped into the water, and climbed up the side of the boat to the deck. From there, he opened the hatch from the outside, and the prisoners spilled out onto the deck of a drifting fishing boat. They were still in danger, lost at sea with no idea where they were or how to get back to shore. But they weren't trapped in a hold waiting to die. Some of the prisoners knew boats, knew how to read the sun and stars, knew which direction the coast lay. They managed to guide the vessel back to shore, back to land, back to life. Bill had escaped death a second time, The third capture involved Chinese bandits, not Japanese soldiers, collaborationists, the kind of men who worked for whoever paid them or whoever threatened them most effectively. These were opportunists operating in the chaos of war, men who'd profit from either side depending on which way the wind blew. They grabbed Bill somewhere in the countryside, probably after observing him for days, probably after deciding he was worth more as a hostage or a source of goods than as a corpse. They held him in some makeshift camp, surrounded by armed men who eyed him with calculation rather than hatred. Bill assessed his situation quickly. These men weren't ideologically committed to the Japanese cause. They were pragmatists, survivors, criminals who saw the war as a business opportunity, which meant they could be negotiated with, unlike Japanese soldiers who followed orders and adhered to military discipline. Bill noticed that their leader was sick, very sick. The man was lying on a cot, fevered and weak, probably suffering from infection or disease. In the countryside during wartime, even minor illnesses could become life-threatening without proper medical treatment. Bill saw his opening. He convinced them to make a trade. Let him go, and he'd bring back medicine for their leader. Antibiotics, if he could get them. Something to fight the infection that was killing the man who controlled these bandits. It was a gamble. Bill was essentially asking them to release him on the promise that he'd return with valuable medical supplies, when he could just as easily disappear and never come back. The bandits knew this. They argued among themselves, voices raised in debate. Some wanted to just shoot Bill and be done with it. Others wanted to hold him for ransom. But a few understood that their leader's life was worth more than whatever Bill might be carrying, and if the man died, the group would probably fragment and dissolve. They agreed to the trade, but not unconditionally. They kept his walking stick, the hollowed-out cane that had served him so well. They probably suspected it contained something valuable, documents or money. It was insurance, leverage. And they made clear that if Bill didn't return, they'd hunt him down. They had contacts throughout the region, people who'd recognize him, people who'd report his movements. Running would only delay the inevitable. Bill agreed to the terms and left, wounded and exhausted, but alive. He made his way to a BAAG outpost and explained what happened. They gave him antibiotics, precious supplies that were meant for Allied personnel and resistance fighters, now being redirected to save the life of a collaborationist bandit leader. But that was the price of Bill's survival, and in intelligence work, you made deals with whoever could help you achieve your objectives. Bill returned to the bandit camp with the medicine. The bandits were surprised. Most prisoners who promised to return never did. But Bill kept his word. He handed over the antibiotics, explained the dosage, and waited while they treated their leader. When it became clear the medicine would work, when the fever started to break, they let him go. They even returned his walking stick. That was the transaction. His freedom for medical supplies they couldn't get any other way. Bill had escaped death a third time, this time through negotiation rather than luck. I need to pause here and ask you something. Bill Chong was forced to dig his own grave by the same Japanese army fighting against the country that had rejected him for being Chinese. The same Canada that wouldn't let him vote, wouldn't let him swim in public pools, wouldn't let him enlist, that Canada was at war with Japan, and Bill was risking his life behind enemy lines for the Allied cause. Here's what I keep thinking about. Does patriotism make sense when your country treats you as less than equal? What drives someone to risk everything for a nation that wouldn't even grant them basic dignity? Bill said he was full of hate after watching the Japanese kill Canadians in Hong Kong. But those Canadians were part of a system that had rejected him his entire life. So, what was he really fighting for? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm genuinely curious where you stand on this. After 3 years of this work, after 3 captures and 3 escapes, after hundreds of miles traveled and hundreds of lives saved, the war finally ended. Japan surrendered in August 1945 following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The occupation collapsed. Prisoners were liberated. The machinery of war ground to a halt. Bill had survived. He'd walked away from his own grave, escaped from a sealed boat hold, negotiated his freedom from bandits. He'd guided hundreds of people to safety. He'd delivered intelligence that helped the Allied war effort. And in 1946, Hong Kong's governor called him forward for recognition. The ceremony was formal, official, witnessed by British military and colonial officials. Bill Chong was decorated with the British Empire Medal, an honor recognizing exceptional service to the Crown. He became the only Chinese Canadian ever to receive that particular distinction. The British recognized what he'd done, the value he'd provided to BAAG and MI9, the courage he'd demonstrated behind enemy lines, the effectiveness of his operations over 3 years of constant danger. They saw Agent 50 for what he was, one of their most successful operatives in the Pacific Theater, and they asked him to stay on. The war was over, but intelligence work never ends. One conflict simply transforms into another. The British wanted Bill to continue working for them, running operations out of Hong Kong now that it had been liberated and restored to British control. Bill agreed. What else was he going to do? Return to Vancouver and scrub floors? Go back to cooking in houses where families didn't learn his name? He had skills now, specialized knowledge, proven capabilities. British intelligence valued him in ways Canada never had. So, Bill worked for British intelligence for the next 30 years, operating out of Hong Kong and carrying out missions into Communist China. The Cold War replaced the Hot War, but the work remained fundamentally the same. Gather intelligence, run assets, operate in hostile territory, survive. The enemy changed from Japanese occupation forces to Mao's communist regime, but the methods remained familiar. Bill ran intelligence operations in Mao's China the same way he'd run them in Japanese-occupied territory, carefully, cleverly, always aware that one mistake meant death or worse. Communist China was paranoid, brutal in its treatment of suspected spies, efficient in its internal security apparatus. But Bill had learned from the best, had survived the worst, and he kept working until 1976, when he finally retired at age 65. 30 years of intelligence work, 3 years against the Japanese, 27 against the communists. That's most of a career, most of a life, spent operating in the shadows and the gaps. And when it was finally over, when Bill had given everything he could give to British intelligence, he returned to Canada, to the country that had rejected him, to the city that wouldn't let him swim in its pools, to the society that had told him for 30 years he wasn't good enough. He came back as a decorated intelligence operative with decades of service to the Allied cause and the British Crown. And nobody knew, nobody cared. Nobody asked where he'd been or what he'd done. Bill lived in obscurity, just another elderly Chinese-Canadian man in Vancouver. He had his British Empire medal somewhere, probably in a drawer or a box in the closet. He had memories that would never leave him. The grave he'd dug, the boat hold he'd escaped, the people he'd saved, the constant terror of working behind enemy lines. But none of it was part of the public record. The hundreds of lives he'd saved, the intelligence he'd gathered, the times he'd stared down death, none of it mattered in Vancouver in the 1970s. Bill didn't talk about it. That generation of intelligence operatives understood something fundamental. Secrecy didn't end with retirement. You kept the secrets until you died. You didn't tell war stories at dinner parties. You didn't seek recognition or validation. You just lived with what you'd done and who you'd been, and you let it stay buried. Decades passed. Bill grew old in silence. The world moved on. World War II became history, then distant history, then the kind of history that school children learned about in textbooks that reduced complex events to simple narratives about good and evil. The specifics blurred. The individual stories faded. Heroes were remembered if they fit the narrative, forgotten if they didn't. And a Chinese-Canadian intelligence operative who'd worked for the British didn't fit the narrative Canada wanted to tell about itself. But then, somebody noticed a photograph. An old picture of Bill receiving an award from Hong Kong's governor. Somebody saw it and asked questions. Word spread in the local veterans community. They talked Bill into joining a veterans organization, And once he started talking, once the stories came out, people realized what had been living among them unnoticed. A genuine war hero, one of the most effective intelligence operatives in the Pacific Theater, had been living in Vancouver for years, and nobody knew. The Canadian Broadcasting Corporation made a documentary about him. Bill's story finally emerged from the shadows. He talked about growing up in racist Vancouver, about being rejected by military recruiters, about witnessing the execution of Canadian soldiers in Hong Kong, about becoming Agent 50. He talked about the walking stick with the hidden compartment, about the smugglers in Macau, about digging his own grave and waiting for the bullet. He talked about the hundreds of people he'd guided to safety, about the pilots and POWs who owed him their lives, and he talked about coming home to a Canada that had no idea what he'd done. If you've made it this far, thank you for joining me on this deep dive into the story of a hero who almost disappeared from history entirely. This channel is about uncovering these hidden stories, about finding the people who shaped our world in ways that never made headlines, who did extraordinary things without recognition or reward. We publish new episodes every single day, covering everything from forgotten spies to overlooked inventors to the human stories behind major historical events. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the perfect time. Hit that button and turn on notifications. Bill Chong died in 2006 at the age of 95. He'd lived long enough to see his story told, to receive recognition from the CBC and the veterans community, to know that his work hadn't been completely forgotten. But his story raises uncomfortable questions about how we remember heroes and who gets to be one. Bill was rejected by Canada because he was Chinese. That rejection wasn't personal or random. It was policy. It was system. It was the explicit racism of the era. The military didn't want Chinese Canadian soldiers. The government didn't grant Chinese Canadians voting rights. Society didn't allow them into public swimming pools. This wasn't ancient history. This was the 1940s. Bill lived through all of it, absorbed all that rejection and discrimination, and still tried to serve. When Canada turned him away, he found another path. When the British offered him dangerous work behind enemy lines, he took it. When faced with his own execution 3 separate times, he kept going. The British recognized his value immediately. They gave him missions, trusted him with intelligence work, decorated him with a medal. After the war, they asked him to keep working, and he did for 3 more decades. The country that rejected him got the benefit of his service anyway, because Bill fought for the Allied cause, and Canada was part of that cause. But when he came home, that service meant nothing. No recognition, no acknowledgement, no compensation for years of risking his life. Just obscurity. It took a random photograph for anyone to notice. Think about that. If nobody had spotted that picture of Bill receiving the British Empire Medal from Hong Kong's governor, if nobody had asked questions, his story would have died with him in 2006. All those lives saved, all that intelligence gathered, all that courage demonstrated behind enemy lines, it would have vanished. Agent 50 would have remained a code name in classified British files that maybe someday a historian would stumble across and wonder about. The CBC documentary changed that, preserved his story, gave Bill a measure of recognition in his final years. But how many other Agent 50s are out there? How many Chinese Canadian, Japanese American, Indigenous, Black, and other minority soldiers and operatives served with distinction and died in obscurity because their stories didn't fit the narrative, because nobody thought to ask, because the racism that shaped their lives also shaped how history remembered them? Bill's story asks us to confront something uncomfortable. Patriotism is complicated when your country doesn't see you as fully human. Service means something different when it's performed despite rejection, rather than because of acceptance. Bill didn't fight for the Canada that existed in the 1940s. He fought for something else. Maybe he fought for the Canada that should exist, the one that would eventually recognize Chinese Canadians as equal citizens. Maybe he fought because he'd witnessed something so brutal in Hong Kong that it overrode everything else. Maybe he fought because he needed to prove something to himself, not to Canada. Whatever his reasons, he proved that citizenship isn't transactional. He didn't wait for Canada to earn his service. He served anyway. The British gave him a medal. Canada gave him nothing until someone noticed a photograph decades later. That disparity tells you everything you need to know about whose service gets remembered and whose gets forgotten. Bill survived 3 captures, 3 near executions, 3 years behind enemy lines. He guided hundreds of people to safety. He gathered intelligence that helped the Allied war effort. He did all of this after being rejected for military service because he was Chinese, and he came home to silence. So here's my final question for you. When we talk about war heroes, when we build monuments and tell stories about courage and sacrifice, whose stories are we telling and whose are we forgetting? Bill Chong's story was almost lost forever. How many others are gone completely, erased not by time, but by the same racism that shaped their lives? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. This matters. These stories matter. The people we forget tell us as much about ourselves as the people we remember. Bill Chong died at 95, having lived long enough to see his story told. Agent 50 finally came in from the cold, decades after the war ended. The man Canada rejected became a hero anyway. The question is, how many others did the same and died without anyone knowing?